isn't fair. You know it. Even if you've spent your life pretending otherwise, right now, while you're watching this, someone with less talent, less intelligence, and fewer skills is living a life you've dreamed of. They're being respected, admired, and followed, not because they deserve it, not because they worked harder, but because they understand the mechanics of influence, power, and human psychology in a way you haven't. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, I was that person who had all the answers, but no one listened. I worked harder than everyone around me. I learned faster, and I thought that effort alone would earn me respect. But the world wasn't set up that way. The louder, bolder, and more ruthless people rose above me. They didn't know more. They weren't smarter. They just knew how to play the game. The dark game of perception, manipulation, and psychological strategy. And they played it flawlessly. I watched as confident, reckless people got promoted over the diligent, as manipulative people built empires while honest people struggled, and as charismatic sociopaths attracted followers while genuinely kind and competent people were left alone, invisible. It made me angry, yes, but it also made me aware. I began to see the truth nobody wants to admit. The world does not reward intelligence. It does not honor goodness. It does not care about fairness. It rewards influence, presence, and psychological dominance. I remember the moment it clicked for me. I had spent weeks trying to prove my value at work, taking on extra projects, offering solutions, helping everyone, and yet nothing changed. Meanwhile, a colleague, less skilled and far less disciplined, was praised, given opportunities, and elevated in ways that made no logical sense. I felt invisible, frustrated, and powerless. But that frustration forced me to ask a brutal question. Why are some people consistently successful while others, equally capable, are ignored? The answer was terrifying. People succeed not because they are smarter, kinder, or more talented. They succeed because they understand human psychology better than you do. They understand that the world is not a meritocracy. They understand that influence, presence, and perceived value often outweigh skill, effort, and integrity. And they know how to manipulate the perception of others to their advantage. I immersed myself in the works of Machiavelli, not the watered-down version from high school history class, but the real text, the observations of a man who lived in a world built entirely on betrayal, strategy, and human weakness. Machiavelli observed how kingdoms rose and fell not because of justice or virtue, but because of the people who mastered human behavior. He understood that while most people wait for fairness, the cunning rewrite the rules. And he laid out principles that allowed people to rise above mediocrity, manipulate perception, and command influence. The first truth I learned is that fairness is a trap. We're taught that if we are honest, kind, and principled, the world will recognize it. It never does. Every time you wait for fair treatment, someone else is already taking the opportunity. Every time you follow the rules, someone else is rewriting them behind your back. Every time you hope for reciprocity, manipulators exploit your predictable behavior. Think about your life. How many times have you respected someone who didn't respect you? How many times have you gone out of your way to help someone who never returned the favor? How many times have you waited patiently for your turn while others pushed their way ahead? This isn't about bad luck, it's about programming. You've been trained to lose by being psychologically compliant. And while you wait for fairness, someone else is taking what you want. Machiavelli wrote that men should either be treated generously or destroyed, because they take revenge for slight injuries. For heavy ones, they cannot. This doesn't mean violence. It means that minor slights can fester, that half measures make you weak, and that decisive, absolute action establishes power. Most people respond with half-hearted resistance, soft boundaries, or feeble arguments. The result? They look weak, and their enemies know exactly how to push them around. I learned to stop praying for fairness and start acting strategically. When someone disrespects me now, I don't argue, I don't plead. I demonstrate through actions that disrespect comes with immediate consequences. I reward loyalty, but I don't hesitate to withdraw support from those who take advantage. I learned that fairness without power is meaningless. It only makes you a target. Ruthlessness, I discovered next, isn't about losing control or becoming cruel. It's about emotional discipline. The world confuses ruthlessness with rage, but true psychological power comes from control. I used to react emotionally to insults, attacks, and setbacks. I would argue, explain, justify, and get pulled into conflicts I could never win. But the truly powerful do not react. They respond with precision. They feel the anger, the humiliation, the frustration, but they channel it into calculated action. I remember a colleague publicly humiliating me during a meeting. Most people would have exploded, shouting, defending, pleading for justice. I didn't. I noted the attack, felt the emotion, then asked myself, what response will maximize my advantage and minimize my exposure? I didn't have to win the argument. I had to assert control. So I responded with a calm, strategic correction that not only neutralized the attack, but highlighted my composure and intelligence. Everyone in the room noticed. That one response, chosen and controlled, carried more weight than any argument I could have made in rage. Emotional discipline turns predictability into power. People who can be manipulated through anger, frustration, or fear are easy to control. People who respond with strategy, calm, and decisiveness are respected, feared, and followed. The world doesn't care about your feelings. It cares about the perception of your power. This leads to another revelation. Likability is vastly overrated. The world doesn't reward people who are nice, agreeable, or liked. It rewards those who are respected. Likable people get overlooked, taken advantage of, and ignored. Psychologically dominant people are treated with caution because others understand there are consequences for crossing them. They don't seek approval, they command it. Think about your social circles. Who makes decisions? Who sets the tone? Who do people actually listen to? It's rarely the person everyone likes. It's the person whose opinion carries weight, whose actions demand attention, whose presence creates influence. Machiavelli said, "It is much safer to be feared than loved if one has to lack one of the two." Respect is non-negotiable. Likability is optional. Decisive action is the next layer of this reality. Most people make weak moves repeatedly, threatening consequences they never enforce. They complain, negotiate, argue, and repeat themselves, training everyone around them to ignore their warnings. Psychologically dominant people act differently. They choose rare, strong actions that are immediate, memorable, and final. When they act, it's decisive. When they speak, it carries weight. Their influence is undeniable because it's reinforced by consistent results, not empty threats. Perception, I learned, is reality. People rarely evaluate you based on your true abilities. They rely on cues, body language, tone, confidence, and the stories told about you. If you don't control how others see you, someone else will, and it won't be in your favor. Those who master perception management can appear competent, confident, and dominant, even if they are still learning behind the scenes. Those who ignore it are invisible, underestimated, and easily manipulated. Narrative control is even more potent. Every action can be interpreted in multiple ways. The person who controls the story controls perception. When you make a tough decision, frame it strategically. When attacked, reframe the story to show strength or reveal the weakness of your attacker. When successful, control how others perceive that success. The story often matters more than the fact. And if you let others tell the story first, they own the narrative forever. Creating systematic consequences was another revelation. Instead of reacting emotionally, I built systems. People who respect me gain access to my time and resources. People who disrespect me face natural consequences. Systems remove emotion and manipulation from interactions. They make my authority automatic, predictable, and unavoidable. This is the silent backbone of power. You don't argue for respect. You enforce it structurally. Finally, I learned the power of silence. Real influence is quiet. The loudest, most aggressive people often have the least control. The quiet observer sees everything, calculates strategically, and strikes with precision. True dominance is felt, not announced. It's demonstrated in actions, results, and presence. By the time I understood these principles, I stopped being the invisible, frustrated observer of life. I became someone who influenced events instead of reacting to them. Someone who commanded respect instead of begging for it. Someone who no longer waited for fairness, but created it for themselves. The world hadn't changed. It had always been the same brutal, unfair place, but I had changed. And once you see these truths, you can never go back. You either learn them or you continue being manipulated by those who already have. I realized quickly that understanding these principles wasn't enough. Seeing the game was one thing. Playing it successfully was another. Because the truth is, the world doesn't pause while you figure it out. People who mastered these psychological rules were already moving, already taking the life you thought was yours, already exploiting the gaps in your understanding. The lesson was brutal. Knowledge without execution is meaningless. And execution requires a willingness to operate in spaces most people refuse to enter. The gray areas, the uncomfortable zones where morality, fairness, and kindness meet cold calculation. I started paying attention to the people around me, not just their words, but the patterns, the hidden cues, the invisible hierarchies. I watched coworkers who seemed harmless, even likable, quietly manipulate situations in their favor. They never raised their voices, never made threats, never begged anyone for recognition. But somehow, they were always in the right place at the right time. Opportunities seemed to find them. Doors that should have been closed to them opened effortlessly. And when they encountered resistance, they didn't complain. They acted. Once, in a single calculated move, a colleague removed a rival from a high-profile project without anyone noticing the maneuver until it was already completed. The rival had no idea what happened until the consequences were unavoidable. That was the first time I saw silent dominance in action, and it terrified me. I started reflecting on why people like that always seemed to win. They didn't need to be the smartest. They didn't need to be the hardest workers. They understood cause and effect in human behavior. They understood what made people obey, defer, fear, and respect. They understood that influence is a currency, and it's far more valuable than intelligence or effort alone. They understood the unspoken rules of power, the subtle levers that tilt situations in their favor, and the psychological triggers that prompt others to act without realizing why. The first step in their power was always perception. They knew that how they were seen mattered far more than who they really were. A smart person who works diligently but slouches, avoids eye contact, and apologizes constantly is invisible. A less competent person who walks in with confidence, makes clear eye contact, speaks with authority, and moves as if the room bends to their presence suddenly becomes unavoidable. I realize that perception isn't about lying. It's about presenting reality strategically. Confidence communicates competence even before competence is demonstrated. Dominance is communicated in posture, tone, and subtle social cues long before a single action is taken. But perception alone wasn't enough. Those who thrived also mastered narrative. They controlled the story before anyone else could. If a mistake was made, it was reframed as a learning opportunity. If someone challenged them, it was framed as envy or misunderstanding. Every action had a context, carefully prepared to ensure that when people talked, they repeated the version most favorable to the manipulator. I began to understand that in life, facts matter far less than stories. The first person to tell the story usually wins. And if you don't control the narrative, someone else will control your reputation and your opportunities without you ever realizing it. Observation became my obsession. I began to notice patterns in interactions that I'd previously ignored. People rarely act randomly. Even the most seemingly irrational decisions are based on predictable psychological responses. Fear, pride, envy, desire, loyalty, and shame are all tools, and every person responds to these levers in consistent ways. Those who understand these levers can manipulate environments, conversations, and decisions without resorting to force. Influence is quiet. Influence is invisible. Influence is the art of creating predictable outcomes without anyone noticing the hand guiding them. One of the first lessons I put into practice was emotional discipline. Before, I had responded emotionally to slights, insults, and competition. I argued, justified, and lost battles I could have won. Now, I paused. I learned to feel the anger, frustration, and humiliation, but never let it dictate action. Instead, I asked, what outcome serves me best? What response not only neutralizes this threat, but increases my advantage? The emotionally reactive people around me became predictable, manipulable. Their own lack of discipline became their weakness. Meanwhile, my calm, measured responses began to earn attention. People started noticing my composure, and with composure comes respect. But composure is only the foundation. Next comes action. Weak people constantly threaten, complain, and negotiate. Strong people act decisively. The difference is stark. A weak person constantly tells a team member to change behavior, hoping repeated warnings will work. The strong person acts once, decisively, visibly, and in a way that creates lasting consequences. The lesson I learned was simple. Fewer, stronger actions outweigh constant, weak interventions. The world notices results, not intentions. and decisive action establishes psychological authority in a way that words never can. I also discovered the subtle power of scarcity and absence. People who always make themselves available, who never say no, who give endlessly without consequence, are easily exploited. Those who occasionally withhold themselves, who make their time, energy, and approval contingent on behavior, gain unspoken influence. It's simple. When something is scarce, it has value. When your attention, help, or presence becomes scarce, others will compete for it, respect it, and adjust their behavior to earn it. This is one of the most overlooked forms of psychological dominance because it's silent. No shouting, no posturing, just strategic absence. Manipulation isn't inherently malicious. It's understanding cause and effect in human behavior and positioning yourself to benefit. I realize that in almost every interaction, people unconsciously manipulate each other. The difference is that most do so randomly, clumsily, or in ways that undermine themselves. The people who thrive do it methodically, strategically, and with foresight. They anticipate reactions, frame narratives, and create systems where outcomes are predictable. The systems I built were simple but profound. Respect leads to access. Disrespect leads to natural consequences. Generosity is rewarded with loyalty. Selfishness is met with exclusion. By formalizing these rules into observable systems, I remove emotion from my influence. People stopped arguing with me. They responded to the predictable outcomes. Those who respected me gained benefits. Those who didn't faced consequences. The beauty of this approach is that it works without constant enforcement. Systems maintain themselves and psychological authority becomes automatic. Perhaps the most important lesson was the power of silent observation. Those who dominate psychologically rarely announce their power. They move quietly, calculate meticulously, and strike strategically. Loud, aggressive displays of power often indicate insecurity, not control. True dominance is felt rather than proclaimed. It is demonstrated through results, through influence over decisions, through the subtle shifts in others' behavior that indicate respect, fear, or deference. I began testing these principles in small ways, observing reactions, refining my approach. Every interaction became a microcosm of influence. Negotiations, office politics, friendships, even casual social encounters. They all followed patterns I could manipulate. I started predicting outcomes. I started guiding decisions without overtly intervening. And I began to see a frightening truth. Most people are predictable. Most people are manipulable. And those who understand this can consistently gain power, influence, and opportunity without the majority ever realizing how it happened. I realized the difference between the people who succeed and those who fail isn't intelligence, talent, or effort. It's psychological sophistication. It's understanding perception, narrative, emotional control, decisive action, and silent dominance. It's building systems that enforce your authority. It's knowing when to be ruthless and when to be discreet. It's operating in a way that is invisible yet inevitable. And here's the brutal part. Those who refuse to learn these principles are already being controlled. While you hesitate, someone else is positioning themselves in your life, in your career, in your relationships. They are exploiting your predictability, your fairness, your emotional reactions, and they are winning. By the time I fully grasped this, I had stopped being the victim of circumstance. I had stopped hoping for fairness, hoping for recognition, or waiting for opportunity. I began creating it, shaping it, and controlling it. I became someone who could act decisively, command respect, and influence outcomes. I became someone who understood that while smart people fail waiting for the world to reward them, the ruthless succeed by understanding how the world actually works. This realization is uncomfortable. It challenges everything you've been taught about morality, fairness, and effort. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can choose to stay naive, predictable, and compliant, or you can act with understanding, strategy, and psychological sophistication. You can begin to take control of your life in a way that most people will never comprehend. Because the truth is simple and it's harsh. Intelligence alone is powerless. Kindness alone is exploitable. Effort alone is invisible. Influence is power. Presence is authority. Psychological dominance is survival. And those who master it don't just win. They shape the world around them while everyone else struggles to understand why life isn't fair. You learn to see the game and to move inside it. You learn to control perception, to shape narratives, to act decisively, and to use silence like a blade. But seeing the rules is one thing. Mastering the mechanics that make people bend without noticing is another. This is where things get deeper and more dangerous. The hidden levers, the cognitive blind spots, the conversational traps that almost everyone walks into without realizing. This is where the difference between a competent operator and a master shows itself. I began to map those levers. I watched conversations like a chess player watches a board, tracking not just the pieces, but the likely sequence of moves. I stopped focusing on content and started focusing on process. How people feel, how they predict, how they rationalize. I looked for patterns of mental shortcuts that people use to save energy and make decisions. Cognitive biases, anchoring reciprocity, scarcity, social proof, were no longer abstract psychology terms. They were functioning tools, and understanding them meant you could guide people gently, predictably, and invisibly. One of the first tricks I learned to notice and then use ethically was the power of anchoring. People latch on to the first number, the first tone, the first impression, and then adjust slightly from that anchor. In negotiations, the first price mentioned shapes the rest of the discussion. In social status, the first impression shapes the narrative that follows. I started setting anchors deliberately. If I wanted someone to value my time, I'd mention my calendar's limited windows early in a conversation. If I wanted someone to see an idea as bold, I framed it next to a more extreme option. Suddenly, my original idea seemed measured and wise. Anchoring isn't trickery. When used to clarify trade-offs, it's guidance. But it works because most people don't notice they're being guided. Reciprocity taught me how generosity, used poorly, creates dependencies, and used strategically, creates loyalty. There's a trap where giving frequently makes people entitled. I learned instead to give selectively and to attach subtle conditions. Help becomes more valuable when it's rare and intentional. When someone receives help that feels earned, they're more likely to repay it in meaningful ways. When help is free and abundant, it becomes invisible. So I learned to give in ways that encouraged future alignment, a well-placed favor, a clearly appreciated competence, a small act with visible impact. People began to reciprocate because the favor felt significant, not because they assumed it would always exist. Scarcity is another lever, and one of the simplest to implement. When something is abundant, people ignore it. When something is scarce, people desire it. I tested this in meetings and collaborations. The person who is always available is taken for granted. The person who is selectively available is sought after. I began to create intentional scarcity around my time and attention. I declined low-value requests politely but firmly. I made myself unavailable for things that diluted my influence. The result was predictable. People who wanted my help made clearer requests, appreciated it more, and treated my time as valuable currency. Scarcity changes behavior because it changes perceived worth. Social proof. What other people do became a way to direct decisions without overt persuasion. Humans use other humans as a shortcut to decide what's acceptable, desirable, or profitable. If you want someone to take a course, show them that respected peers already did. If you want your proposal to gain traction, cite early adopters who benefited. You don't fabricate social proof. You create environments where the right behaviors are visible and normalized. People will follow the visible pattern because their brains prefer the safety of consensus. But the most subtle lever of all was language, how questions, phrasing, and timing shift choices. I stopped asking direct questions and started asking leading questions that framed the answer I wanted without forcing it. Instead of, "Can you do this?" I learned to ask, "Which of these two options works best for you?" People feel agency when given choices, even if both choices favor the outcome I want. Framing options, using conditional language, and timing a pause before a question. These small linguistic moves steer decisions more reliably than arguments ever could. There's also the mirror technique, which looks innocent but is incredibly powerful. People trust mirrors because mirrors reflect them back. I listened for core emotional themes in conversations, ambition, fear, insecurity, and echoed them in my responses. When someone said, "I'm overwhelmed," I didn't immediately offer solutions. I first said, "It sounds like you're carrying a lot right now." That simple reflection made them feel seen, which lowered defenses and opened the door to influence. This isn't false empathy. It's a way of creating alignment. When people feel understood, they're more likely to accept your guidance. It is one of the quietest, most ethical tools of persuasion. Not every lever has to be manipulative. Some are protective. Controlled exposure is a defensive tool that I began to use obsessively. Oversharing is social suicide in a world that treats vulnerability as liability. I learned to reveal information in layers, to let people discover my competence gradually. There's a power in being a slow-burning mystery. Curiosity draws people in, and when you reveal skill at the right moment, it registers as competence and depth rather than bragging. Controlled exposure also prevents opponents from accumulating ammunition. If you don't reveal your strategy, you can't be undermined easily. Another lever is pattern disruption. People fall into behavioral grooves because routines conserve effort. If you want to break someone's autopilot, change a pattern. A colleague who expects passive agreement will reactively defend their turf if surprised by a decisive move. Small, unexpected acts, an abrupt change of venue, a different tone, a surprising concession force people to reassess. When their autopilot breaks, they have to think, and thinking is where you can guide them. Pattern disruption creates momentary chaos, and in that chaos, the person who can think strategically has the advantage. But knowledge of these levers raises an ethical question I asked myself constantly. Where is the line between influence and exploitation? I decided to make two rules. First, never use these tactics to harm or coerce innocents. Second, use them to create better outcomes for everyone, including those being influenced. Influence should improve decisions, not trap people into harmful choices. When I use these strategies to help someone escape a toxic job, to negotiate a fairer deal, or to protect my boundaries in a way that improved group dynamics, I felt justified. When I used them only to hoard advantage at others' expense, I felt hollow. Power without ethics corrodes. That was a lesson that kept me from becoming the villain in my own story. There are times when these levers must be used quietly without announcement. Silent dominance is not bragging, it's outcome-driven discretion. I learned to place moves without drawing attention to them. Instead of publicly attacking a rival, I would reposition allies, shift resources, and let the rival's influence erode naturally. The change would be visible in results long before anyone could trace the hand that created it. People felt the loss, not the maneuver. That's the most elegant form of power. When outcomes change and people assume it was inevitable rather than engineered. A dangerous trap I watched others fall into was overexposure, showing all your cards too early. When you reveal your whole strategy at once, you allow counters to form. I began to think like a storyteller. Reveal conflict gradually, build tension, and resolve at the moment of greatest impact. That approach applies to careers, negotiations, and relationships. Lead with competence, not with full disclosure. Let your value accumulate like interest, not like a one-time payout. When you reveal gradually, you create a narrative of continuous growth and inevitability that others will attribute to your genius rather than to your calculation. You also need to be fluent in moral ambiguity. Life rarely offers clean black and white choices. Sometimes, the best outcome for the greatest number requires hard decisions. I learned to evaluate outcomes first and optics second. Would a harsh decision protect more people in the long run? Would a public, decisive act prevent greater harm later? Moral clarity is admirable in theory. Pragmatic ethics wins in practice. That said, pragmatic ethics must be bounded by non-negotiable values, lines you refuse to cross. Without those lines, strategy becomes cynicism. With them, strategy becomes stewardship. One of the most practical shifts I made was operational. I stopped letting my calendar be an open invitation. I treated my time like a finite resource and priced it accordingly. People who valued me began to respect time-based constraints. Those who didn't drifted away. This solved 1,000 small problems: fewer pointless meetings, clearer priorities, and a reputation for being in demand. Scarcity applied to time produces respect faster than any rant about standards ever will. I also learned to cultivate allies silently. The appearance of support is often more persuasive than raw authority. When respected people voluntarily endorse you, others follow without questioning why. I invested in relationships where mutual value was clear and reciprocal. I never begged for endorsements. I earned them by delivering results for others. That created a network that amplified my moves without requiring public boasting. Influence accumulates like compound interest. Small, consistent investments produce large, durable returns. As I became more practiced, I began to notice how predictable people really were. Most decisions are heuristic, shortcuts people take to save effort. Once you understand the shortcut, you can guide the decision without argument. That's not magic. It's applied psychology. It's about building environments where the decision you want is the path of least resistance. Make the right choice easier than the wrong one, and people will choose it. That's how influence becomes sustainable. Finally, the quietest lever, self-mastery, proved the deepest. All of these external tactics fail if you cannot master yourself. If you react impulsively, your anchors break. If you lose discipline, your systems collapse. If you abandon your ethical lines, your reputation, your greatest asset, erodes. Self-mastery binds strategy to integrity. It makes influence durable. It transforms tactical wins into a life that people trust and follow. When I look back, the path from naive competence to strategic influence was a steady accumulation of small changes. I learned to notice patterns, to set anchors, to manage scarcity, to reflect emotions, to control exposure, to disrupt patterns, to think in narratives, and to build systems. I learned to act less and act better, to let silence do the heavy lifting, and to use power in ways that protected both myself and others. These aren't manipulative tricks to dominate innocently. They're tools to navigate a world that rewards influence more than virtue. If you're still unconvinced, test it with tiny experiments. Create scarcity around a favor. Frame a request with anchors. Echo someone's core need and watch how they open. Try controlled exposure. Reveal a skill slowly and notice the change in how people respond. These small ethical experiments will teach you more than 100 theories. You'll see outcomes change, and with that, your confidence will grow. Mastery isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming a more effective, ethical version of yourself. Someone who can protect what matters, influence outcomes positively, and refuse to be manipulated. Once you learn these levers, you will see how many people around you simply react, how many opportunities they missed because they wait for fairness, and how many lives you can change by choosing to act with strategic clarity. The world may not be fair, but it is navigable, and learning to navigate it is the first step toward not only surviving, but shaping your destiny. I began to see the world differently. Everything I thought I knew about success, influence, and fairness was incomplete. I had been trained to believe that effort guarantees outcomes, that kindness earns loyalty, that intelligence alone is enough to be seen. None of that was wrong, but none of it was sufficient. Life doesn't reward what is fair or what is deserved. Life rewards perception, influence, and the ability to move within invisible currents that most people can't even see. The first lesson I truly internalized is that people are emotional creatures masquerading as rational beings. We all like to think we make decisions based on facts, logic, and merit. But the truth is more brutal. We make decisions based on how those facts make us feel. People act first on instinct and justify later with reason. That's why someone less competent, less skilled, or even less intelligent can outperform someone who is technically superior. They understand the emotional game. They understand how to trigger perception, curiosity, fear, desire, and respect in ways that bend the environment around them. This is where psychological leverage comes in. Leverage is the hidden advantage that no amount of hard work can substitute. It's the subtle understanding that people respond predictably to certain triggers, For example, status is not just earned, it is recognized. Someone can be highly capable and remain invisible because they fail to signal their value in ways that others unconsciously respect. I learned to read the signals that communicate power, posture, tone, timing, decisiveness, and alignment with influence networks. I learned that showing value without asking for permission transforms invisible competence into undeniable authority. But competence and signaling are only part of the equation. Timing is everything. Opportunities rarely wait for readiness. People rarely reward effort alone. What separates winners from those who are merely capable is knowing when to act, and more importantly, when not to act. Acting too soon wastes energy and reveals your hand. Acting too late means someone else has already captured the prize. The world is not patient with those who hesitate, and it's merciless to those who overextend. Mastering timing requires observation, restraint, and anticipation. Observation became my superpower. I stopped assuming people were complex. I started assuming they were predictable. I studied routines, habits, reactions, and weak points. I paid attention to micro-expressions, speech patterns, and decisions under pressure. I tracked which individuals craved recognition, which feared loss, which sought validation, and which operated from detached logic. This wasn't stalking. It was learning the map of human behavior so I could navigate it without collision. When you understand the landscape of human psychology, you no longer wander blindly. You move deliberately. Then came the lesson of influence without confrontation. I realized that the most effective moves are often invisible. You don't need to shout or threaten. You need to shift the environment so that the outcomes you desire naturally emerge. One of the most powerful ways to do this is through anticipation. Anticipate desires, objections, and fears. Then subtly shape conditions so the path toward your goal aligns with the natural inclinations of others. People then feel they are making decisions freely, while you have already steered the results. This is the essence of silent dominance, power that is felt, not proclaimed. Control of perception is another weapon most people ignore. If you're not actively shaping how others perceive your competence, authority, and character, they will fill in the blanks themselves, and rarely in your favor. I began to deliberately curate how I was seen, being present in the right moments, remaining absent in others, letting actions demonstrate capability before words had to. Reputation becomes a currency, and perception is its mint. The better you control how people interpret your actions, the more predictable their reactions become. Equally important is the principle of emotional economy. Most people react impulsively. They give away their energy to trivial disputes, to petty insults, and to imagined slights. I learned that holding emotional energy is a form of power. Reacting deliberately rather than instinctively demonstrates composure, intelligence, and authority. People instinctively recognize the difference between someone whose emotions rule them and someone whose emotions serve them strategically. Composure under pressure is an unspoken declaration of dominance. Another key principle is the art of selective generosity. Influence grows not just by what you take, but by what you give. And giving indiscriminately weakens influence. I learned to give strategically, favors that were visible, support that was valued, and guidance that increased dependency while creating loyalty. Generosity becomes a tool of alignment rather than a moral obligation. When people feel the weight of what you offer, they begin to match it, consciously or unconsciously, and that alignment compounds your influence over time. The next breakthrough came from studying attention as a resource. People have limited cognitive bandwidth, and those who command attention first and in the right way shape decisions more effectively than those with technical superiority. I practiced the skill of commanding attention, speaking with intent, acting with precision, being unpredictable yet reliable. Attention is not earned through noise or volume. It is earned through presence, credibility, and strategic timing. The person who captures attention subtly, consistently, and at the right moments becomes indispensable. Equally crucial is mastering narrative framing. Events themselves rarely determine outcomes. It is the story surrounding events that shapes perception. When conflict arises, the first person to define the narrative often wins. When success is achieved, framing it strategically ensures influence multiplies. I began to preemptively frame stories about myself, about initiatives, and about others' expectations, so that when people interpreted events, they interpreted them in ways that reinforced my influence. Framing is power because perception is reality. Finally, I learned the unspoken rule of patience paired with decisive action. Too many smart people hesitate. They calculate endlessly, waiting for certainty that never comes. Meanwhile, those who understand human behavior, influence, and timing act decisively. Action creates reality. Even imperfect action generates feedback loops that allow improvement. Hesitation guarantees irrelevance. In every opportunity I asked, what small action taken now will shape the trajectory in my favor? Then I acted, observed, adjusted, and repeated. These principles, when combined, form a lattice of influence that is difficult to disrupt. Observation, timing, perception management, emotional discipline, strategic generosity, narrative control, attention mastery, and decisive action. Each element reinforces the other. Mastering one without the others creates gaps. Mastering all creates an almost invisible psychological advantage. You move through life as though the currents bend around you, as though decisions and outcomes naturally align with your intent without anyone understanding how it happened. The final realization I had is that knowledge alone is insufficient. To become someone who doesn't just survive but shapes reality, you must practice relentlessly. Every conversation, every negotiation, every decision is a laboratory. You test, you learn, you adapt. You develop intuition for human behavior. You refine timing, delivery, and framing until they are second nature. Influence becomes habitual, and your presence becomes magnetic because it is grounded in consistent mastery rather than luck or charisma alone. And here's the brutal truth that drives it all home. People who refuse to learn these principles remain prey, no matter how intelligent or kind they are. The world doesn't punish incompetence alone. It punishes predictability, naivety, and inaction. Those who master influence, timing, perception, and decision-making carve paths through a landscape of chaos and emotion that others stumble through blindly. It's not a moral victory, it's a survival imperative. By this point, I no longer ask why smart people fail while psychopaths or strategic operators win. I understood the mechanics. I understood the invisible game that governs influence. And more importantly, I had started playing it. Not with cruelty, not with deception, but with clarity, discipline, and relentless focus on outcomes. understanding psychology isn't just theory. It's the key to moving in a world that rewards the unseen hand, the subtle move, the calculated pause. Once you see the system, you cannot unsee it. You understand why brilliance alone is insufficient, why kindness is not currency, and why patience without action is wasted potential. And you realize with both awe and urgency that mastering these levers, the silent levers of human behavior, the subtle engines of influence, is the difference between being invisible in life and shaping it on your terms. When applied consistently, ethically, and strategically, these principles transform not just results, but perception, relationships, and self-confidence. They shift you from someone who reacts to circumstances into someone who anticipates, shapes, and leads them. They create a psychological presence that is felt long before it is seen, a presence that commands attention, respect, and alignment without announcement. And that is the foundation for what comes next, moving from mastery of the self and the environment into mastery of outcomes that appear inevitable to everyone around you. Mastery that doesn't scream, but whispers. Mastery that doesn't dominate with noise, but with presence. Mastery that transforms intelligence into influence, and influence into the power to move the world quietly, decisively, and strategically. This is the point where the game becomes clear, not because the rules are written, but because you understand the currents beneath them. Not because the world rewards fairness, but because you understand how to bend perception, behavior, and narrative to your advantage. The invisible advantage is no longer invisible. You wield it like a silent force, and everyone else moves around it without realizing. You start noticing it everywhere. People respond differently, doors open more easily, challenges seem smaller, and influence accumulates almost effortlessly. But you also notice a darker truth. Once you understand this, you see how many others are failing without knowing why. You see the smart people who hesitate, the kind people who are walked over, the competent people who are invisible, and you understand. The difference is not intelligence or talent. It is understanding the hidden levers of human behavior and consistently applying them while others sleep. This awareness is both liberating and burdensome. Liberating because you now control what others cannot. Burdensome because you can no longer ignore the forces at play around you. Every interaction becomes a choice. Act strategically or be acted upon. Every opportunity becomes a test. Will you apply what you know or will it slip by? Every misstep is a lesson, and every success a confirmation that mastery is not mystical. It is methodical. This is where most people stop, paralyzed by the complexity or the ethical weight. But for those who continue, who commit to learning, observing, and applying relentlessly, the result is transformation. From reactive to proactive, from invisible to indispensable, from competent to strategically unstoppable. The game is brutal, but it is winnable. And now that you understand these levers, you have the choice. Continue as a passive observer or step fully into mastery, navigating the currents of human behavior with precision, power, and purpose.